So sales of existing fixed assets for you is 0. Why? The book value was 0. All right? So pay attention to those. And change in net working capital, you can think of that as essentially capital spending for short-term assets. Okay? Short-term assets are not subject to depreciation more often than not. So this is kind of a long-term capital spending. This is short-term capital spending. For example, looking at Starbucks, their current assets went up by about 300 million. So changing current assets is 300 million. On the other hand, current liabilities also went up. It went up about 250. So that means net working capital has increased by only 50 million. Just to make sure, let's write down our formula here. Change in net working capital. It's obvious why we look at the change in current assets, because we're spending money, but we also decrease change in current liabilities because it is a source of cash. I don't have to, if my current liabilities increase, that means it's a source of financing for me. Whatever there is left, I can distribute. And CFFA is equal to, this is uses of free cash flow. You could either give the cash to shareholders, or you could give creditors. You know, sometimes I give you enough information to calculate cash flow to shareholders and cash flow to creditors. I ask you to calculate cash flow from assets, then you use this one. Sometimes I give you information about the sources of cash flow. So based on what information you have available, figure out which one of these definitions you're going to use. Let's define cash flow to shareholders. I specifically say cash dividends. You can return money to your shareholders either by paying them cash dividends, or you could repurchase stocks. Okay, if you're repurchasing, that's negative new equity. Cash flow to stockholders, depending upon the case, can be positive, 0, or negative. Except if I told you that there is no new equity, company neither bought or sold new shares, you know that cash flow to stockholders cannot be negative. Why dividends cannot be negative? I mean, company can say, here's $100, but they cannot say, how about this year you gave me money? They're going to say, no, thank you. The only way to get money from shareholders is to sell new shares. Okay? But that would mean, you know, positive new equity. So net new equity is sales of new shares minus repurchase of new shares. Repurchase of existing shares. Let's see what Starbucks have done. You know, this trailing 12 markets, 12 months. We're going to see it in the financing cash flow. They paid $2.5 billion in dividends. And let me see. They issued some new shares, but they actually did a lot of repurchase. So that means the cash flow to stockholders is some of these too. It's almost $4 billion. Depending upon management's view of the value of the shares, they may prefer stock repurchases. If I typically give only dividends, that also kind of sends a signal. It says, I don't think my shares are cheap. How about I give you money, you do whatever you want with it. But if I think that my shares are cheap, for example, NVIDIA, after their latest financial statements, announced a share buyback program of $50 billion. I mean, that's not too much relative to market value of NVIDIA, which is somewhere between $2.5 to $3 trillion. But that tells the market that as NVIDIA management, we think our stock is cheap because we're buying it back. Because in the future, I may sell it when it's higher. For example, personally, I think NVIDIA should be worth $200 to $250. If I'm managing NVIDIA, I'm definitely going to use my cash to buy back stock because the market doesn't value it as much as I do. So I'm going to buy it cheap. So those are two ways you can return money to your shareholders. Oh, this class ends at 12:15. No, 12:30. It's not Tuesday. Cash flow to creditors is interest expense minus net new borrowing. New borrowing minus retirement of or repayment of existing debt. So you can return creditors money two ways. One, you don't pay them their original debt, you just pay them interest, or you just pay your debt back. Okay? Paying debt is negative new borrowing. Similarly, cash flow to creditors could be positive, negative, or zero, depending upon the case. But if I told you that firm has not paid, has not borrowed new money or paid existing debt, you know that it's going to be positive or zero. I got about 15 minutes, so I do a lot of problems in those videos, but let's kind of go through some sample problems. Okay. Let me just pick one of these. We know the company's net working capital. We know the current portion of the long-term debt is valued at 1,300. Also long-term debt of 12,000, equity 21,000. What's the value of net fixed assets? First of all, let's write down our basic equation. Current assets plus net fixed assets equal uh, current liabilities plus long-term debt plus total equity. Okay.